The stagecoach lurched, throwing Catherine against the cracked leather brace for the 100th time. For 3 days, the grit had worked its way into her lungs, her hair, and the fine lace of the veil that covered her face. It was a flimsy shield, offering no protection from the Wyoming sun or the coarse silence of the 2 miners sitting opposite her, who had long since stopped trying to guess at the face beneath the white netting. Catherine, at 19, felt ancient. The exhaustion was a heavy woolen blanket smothering a deeper, sharper anxiety that had been her only companion since leaving Pennsylvania. She was a parcel, posted west to settle a debt. Her father, a man ruined by whiskey and failed investments, had found a solution in the back pages of a gazette, a wealthy rancher in Wyoming territory seeking a wife. The arrangement was made with the speed of a cattle trade. She was to be Mrs. Elias Mercer. The coach groaned to a stop, the driver shouting something lost to the wind. Thistle Hollow. The name itself sounded sharp and unwelcoming. Catherine peeked through the veil in the dirty window. It was not a town. It was a wound in the earth. A single dusty street of false-fronted buildings, baked brown by a relentless sun. A saloon, a mercantile, a smithy, and a land office. That was all. There was no green. Only the endless, pale sagebrush stretching to a sky that was too large, too empty. The miners clambered out, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. The coach door remained open, an expectant mouth. She knew she was the last passenger. "You, Miss Carmichael," a voice cut through the heat. She stiffened, gathering the folds of her gray traveling dress. She stepped down onto the dry plank sidewalk. The light was blinding, and for a moment, she was only a silhouette in a veil. He stood before her, blocking the sun. Elias Mercer was not just older. He was weathered by something other than the elements. He was perhaps 40, tall, and built of thick, solid muscle that his expensive broadcloth suit could not disguise. His face was hard, clean-shaven, with pale eyes that assessed her as they would a horse. He was wealthy. It was in the silver clasp of his bolo tie and the confident stillness of his posture. "I am," she said. Her voice was small, swallowed by the wind. He did not offer a greeting or a hand. He simply took the carpet bag from her grip and turned. "The buggy is here." As she followed him, she felt the eyes of the town. Men pausing with barrels, women peering from the shadows of the mercantile porch. She saw no welcome in their faces, only a mix of curiosity and something that looked like pity. Or perhaps it was fear. They were afraid of him. This man who owned the valley, the water, and now, her. The buggy ride to the ranch was silent, broken only by the snap of the reins and the clatter of the wheels over stone. Catherine kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. She was clutching the veil, her late mother's veil. It was the only beautiful thing she owned, a cascade of Belgian lace that her mother had worn to marry for love. Catherine clung to it as a talisman, a reminder of a world where such things existed. It was meant to be a symbol of purity, of hope. Now, it felt like a shroud. She was intelligent enough to know her position. She observed the land, the way the grass grew thin near the alkali flats, the distant line of snow-capped mountains that looked like broken teeth. She observed the man beside her. His hands on the reins were steady, brutal, and unforgiving. He did not look at her. He drove the horses hard. She had been raised in a soft world of books and piano lessons. This man was not from that world. He was an elemental force, like the wind that tore at her veil, trying to rip it from her head. She held it fast. She was soft-spoken, taught to repress her feelings, to be dutiful. It was that duty that had brought her here. But beneath the compliance, a sharp, keen mind was watching, cataloging, and recoiling. The ranch house was 2 stories, the largest structure she had seen since Cheyenne, but it was grim, built of dark timber, with the narrow windows that looked like suspicions. It sat in a hollow, shielded from the wind but trapped in shadow. A few gaunt cattle bawled in a nearby corral. A silent woman with a face like dried leather, presumably the housekeeper, took Catherine's bag at the door and disappeared without a word. "The judge will be here at dusk," Elias Mercer said, his voice flat. He pointed to the stairs. "Your room is the second on the left. Be ready at 6. He did not call it their room. The wedding was a blur of cold hands and kerosene light. The judge, a thin man who reeked of stale rye, read the words from a book. Catherine whispered, "I do," to the floorboards. Mercer's "I do" was as firm and final as a nail in a coffin lid. There was no celebration, no meal. The housekeeper served a grim stew, which Catherine could not touch. After Ellis led her upstairs, the room was not hers. It was his, large, dark, and smelling of leather, dust, and him. A heavy oak bedstead dominated the space. A single lamp cast monstrous shadows. He shut the door. The sound of the latch clicking into place was the loudest sound she had ever heard. "Take it off," he said. She looked at him, confused. "Mr. Mercer?" The veil. He did not move, just watched her, those pale eyes flat and cold. "I bought a wife. I will see what I have paid for." Her hands trembled as she reached for the delicate pins holding the lace to her hair. This was the moment. The unveiling. It should have been tender. She fumbled with a pin. "Now," he commanded. His impatience vibrated in the air. When her shaking fingers failed again, he crossed the room in 2 strides. He did not unpin it. He gathered the lace in his fist and tore it from her head. The sound of ripping lace and the sharp sting as pins tore at her scalp made her cry out. He threw the ruined veil onto the floor and held her chin in a crushing grip. Turning her face to the light, his eyes roamed over her, from her tear-filled eyes to her trembling mouth, down her throat. It was not desire. It was appraisal. "You are small," he said, his thumb pressing into the soft skin beneath her jaw. "But you will do. You will learn your place." "Please," she whispered, a useless word. "I do not want a wife," he said, his voice dropping, though it lost none of its coldness. "I do not want conversation. I do not want your thoughts. I want obedience. You belong to me, as that chair belongs to me, as the cattle in my field belong to me. Do you understand?" She could only nod, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Good." He released her chin, shoving her slightly. "Take off the dress." This was not a marriage. This was a breaking. He wanted her to know that she was property, an object to be used and discarded at his will. He did not want a partner. He wanted a slave. He hurt her. It was a cold, calculated cruelty. He did not seek pleasure, only her humiliation. He sought to scar her, to instill a terror so deep that she would never dream of defiance. His hands were heavy, his words sharp as he detailed her failings, her uselessness, her father's pathetic weakness. He did not fully consummate the marriage. He was not driven by that kind of passion. He was driven by a need to dominate. He used his belt. He used his voice. He used his cold, terrifying indifference. When she wept, he struck her, a hard, open-handed blow that split her lip and sent her sprawling to the floor. "Get up," he ordered. She lay there, a crumpled heap of wedding finery, blood tasting of copper in her mouth, her body a landscape of new, sharp pains. The ruined veil lay near her hand. He looked down at her, his face a mask of contempt. "You will learn, or you will be broken. It is the same to me." He turned, removed his boots, and lay down on the bed, turning his back to her. Within minutes, the sound of his deep, even breathing filled the room. He was asleep. Catherine lay on the cold floor for an unmeasured time. The only sound was the howling of the wind outside, a rising, frantic shriek that matched the one in her own head. She was bleeding, she was bruised, but worse, she was shamed, The intelligent, soft-spoken girl was gone. In her place was just a thing. Then, the animal instinct took over. The terror that had paralyzed her turned into a frantic, electric energy. Run! She could not stay. She would not stay. She would die out there before she let him touch her again. Slowly, painfully. She pushed herself up. Her ribs screamed. She moved with infinite care, her bare feet silent on the wooden planks. She looked at the door. The key was likely in his pocket. She looked at the window. It was a long drop to the kitchen roof below, but it was the only way. She grabbed the one thing she could not leave behind, the torn, muddied remnant of her mother's veil. She did not bother with shoes or a cloak. She was barefoot, clad only in her thin cotton nightgown, now stained with her own blood. She eased the window sash up. The night air was a shock, cold and alive. The wind tore at her, lashing her with the first drops of rain. A storm was breaking. She climbed out, her bare feet slipping on the shingles of the kitchen roof. She half fell, half slid to the edge and dropped into the deep mud of the yard. The landing sent a jolt of agony up her legs, but she did not make a sound. She ran. She fled the dark, oppressive house, scrambling over a fence and into the open prairie. She ran without direction, away from the ranch, away from the man who owned the valley. The sky ripped open. It was not rain. It was a deluge, a solid wall of ice-cold water that struck the plains with the force of a fist. Thunder cracked directly overhead, so loud it vibrated in her chest. The world was lit in brief, terrifying flashes of white light, revealing an endless, churning sea of prairie grass. She ran, her bare feet sinking into the mud, sharp rocks and prickly pear cutting her soles to ribbons. She did not care. The pain was distant. The only reality was the need to escape. She heard a sound, long and mournful, carried on the wind. Wolves. The howl rose again, closer this time. She sobbed, stumbling forward, her nightgown plastered to her body, the cold sinking into her bones. She was bleeding, she was freezing, she was being hunted by man and by nature. She ran for hours. The terror of Elias Mercer faded, replaced by the immediate terror of the storm and the darkness. The land was flat, offering no shelter, no place to hide. She climbed a small rise, hoping to see a light, a tree, anything. There was nothing but the storm. Her body was failing. The adrenaline was gone, leaving only a deep, penetrating cold and an exhaustion that was heavier than the water-soaked cotton she wore. She tripped, falling hard onto the slick earth, mud coating her face and hair. She tried to stand, but her legs would not obey. She crawled, her hands sinking into the muck, the tattered piece of her mother's veil still clutched in one fist. The rain began to ease, but the wind remained, a high, thin keen. The blackness of the night softened to a miserable, bruised gray. Dawn was coming. Through the lashing grass, she saw a shape, a dark square against the horizon. A building. She crawled toward it, dragging herself through the mud and brush. It was a shack, small and crude, barely more than a hovel. An old line shack, perhaps long abandoned. She reached the wooden wall and tried to pull herself up, to find the door. Her strength was gone. She collapsed against the rough-hewn planks, the world dissolving into a blur of cold and pain. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and the darkness she had been running from finally claimed her. Bo rode his paint horse slow, his head ducked against the lingering bite of the wind. The storm had been a bad one. He was checking the north line, seeing if the creek had jumped its banks. He lived a quiet life, deliberate and solitary. He preferred the company of his horse to that of men. He saw the splash of white against the dark wood of his line shack from 50 yards out. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard. His eyes narrowed. It was not a snowdrift. Not this time of year. It looked like a bundle of rags. He urged the paint horse closer, his movements wary. He swung down from the saddle, landing softly in the mud. It was a person. A woman. She was half-conscious, her face pale as milk, bruised and cut. A nasty gash on her cheek was caked with dried blood and mud. She was barefoot, her feet a raw, bloody ruin. She was dressed in nothing but a thin nightgown, and she was clutching a filthy, torn piece of lace. Beau's face, usually set in a quiet, rugged calm, tightened. He rubbed the old scar on his jaw. A nervous habit. This was trouble. This was the kind of trouble that got a man killed. He knelt, putting his ear near her mouth. She was breathing, shallow, but breathing. He looked around. No wagon, no tracks but her own, already washing away. She had come from the south, from the direction of the Mercer Ranch. A cold understanding settled in his gut. He was a man who wanted to be left alone. He had his own griefs, walled off and private, but he was not a man who could leave a half-dead woman in the mud. He swore, softly, at the sky, at the trouble she represented. Then, with a sigh of reluctance, he slid his arms under her. She weighed almost nothing. He lifted her easily, her head lolling against his chest. He noted the stitched shirt he wore, a patch near the collar, and how the white of her skin contrasted with his rough, sun-darkened flannel. He carried her inside the small shack, kicking the door shut against the wind. It was sparse inside, but clean. A cot, a small stove, a table. He laid her on the cot and covered her with his thick wool bedroll. He stoked the embers in the stove, adding dry juniper until a small, smoky fire took hold. He filled a pot with water to heat. He did not ask questions. He did not wake her. He tended to his horse, his mind working. When he came back in, she was stirring, her eyes fluttering open. They were wide with a terror so profound it made his own chest ache. She tried to scramble back, a small, animal sound of fear in her throat. "Easy," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "You're safe here." He held out a tin cup of lukewarm water. He asked no questions. He did not ask her name, or how she came to be there, or why her face was bruised and her feet were bleeding. He had seen the work of men like Elias Mercer before. She watched him, her eyes tracking his every move, ready to bolt. I fell," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. The lie was flimsy, pathetic. From a wagon." Beau just nodded, turning back to the stove to give her space. He busied himself making coffee, his broad back to her. "A wagon," he repeated, his voice flat, accepting the lie for what it was, a shield, just as flimsy as the veil she still held in a death grip. "Rest. You're safe from the storm." Catherine woke in stages. First, to a dull, throbbing pain that seemed to live in her bones, and second, to a profound, disorienting warmth. She was not cold. The wind was not screaming. She smelled wood smoke, juniper, and coffee, strong and bitter. Her eyes opened. She was not on the muddy prairie. She was in a small, dark room, on a cot, buried under a thick wool bedroll. A man sat at a small table, his back to her, mending a piece of harness. He was the man from the day before, the cowboy with the paint horse and the stitched shirt. She tried to sit up, and a sharp cry of pain escaped her. Every muscle protested. The man turned, not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate motion. He was not alarmed. He was quiet. He held a tin cup in his hand. "Easy," he said. His voice was a low rasp, like stones rubbing together. "You have been sleeping a long time. The storm has passed." He rose, and her body tensed, her hand flying to her throat. He was tall, broader than he had seemed on the horse. He stopped several feet away, sensing her fear. He was used to skittish things. "I brought you in from the mud," he said, stating a simple fact. He gestured to the small stove. "There is broth." He was, she realized, trying to be gentle, but he did not have the words for it. He was a man of deep, ingrained solitude. He placed the cup of broth on a crate near the cot and retreated to his table. He did not ask her name. He did not ask about the wagon. He did not ask why her lip was split or why her arms were blooming with dark, ugly bruises. He just sat, his hands busy with the leather, offering her the simple decency of his silence. Catherine drank the broth. It was hot, salty, and revived a small spark of life in her. She looked down. Someone had cleaned her. Her feet were wrapped in clean rags. Her torn, bloody nightgown was gone. In its place, she wore a man's long flannel undershirt, the wool soft from 100 washings, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. She flushed, pulling the bedroll tighter. He had undressed her. As if hearing her thought, he spoke to the wall, his hands never stopping their work. "Your gown was mud and blood. Near froze you. I left it. It is in the bucket. I kept my back." She believed him. There was no shame in his voice, only practicality. He had treated her not as a woman, but as a foundling, a half-drowned animal pulled from a creek. "My name is Bo," he said, still not looking at her. "This is my line shack. You are safe here, for now." She nodded, though he could not see. "Catherine," she whispered. He nodded, and the silence returned, filled only by the scrape of his awl against the leather. The next few days were a quiet torment of healing. Her feet were the worst. The cuts were deep, and walking was impossible. Bo tended to them with a gruff, impersonal care. He would heat water, unwrap the rags, soak her feet, and apply a pungent, dark salve from a tin. His hands were rough, calloused, the knuckles scarred. They were the hands of a man who worked from sunup to sundown, but his touch was steady, his movements economical. He handled her wounded feet as he might a delicate piece of machinery or a newborn calf. He did not flinch from the wounds, and he did not linger. Catherine, who had learned to fear a man's touch more than anything on earth, found herself slowly, agonizingly, uncoiling. Elias Mercer's hands had been heavy, insistent, and cruel. They took. Bo's hands were steady, respectful, and distant. They gave water, salve, warmth. When he was done, he would wash his hands in a basin and go outside, leaving her to the privacy of her own pain. She spent those first days observing him from the cot. He was a man who owned very little. 1 plate, 1 cup, 1 fork. A bedroll, which he now slept in on the floor, leaving her the cot. A rifle over the door. A sidearm he wore when he rode out. His clothes were mended, the stitches on his shirt collar thick and strong. He had done it himself. He was not a talkative man. His silence was vast, like the prairie itself. It was not an empty silence, but a full one. Catherine, raised in a house where silence was always a prelude to anger, found it comforting. Bo's silence was peaceful. It asked nothing of her. And then there was the scar, a pale, jagged line that ran from his jaw into his collar. She watched him rub it. It was a habit, unconscious, done when he was thinking hard, or when he looked out the window at the empty expanse for too long. He would trace the line of it with his thumb, his gaze distant. She sensed a grief in him that was as deep and raw as her own. It was a different kind, perhaps, older, more settled, but it was there. It was in the way he drank his coffee, staring at the wall. It was in the way he spoke to his horse, with a tenderness he never used inside the shack. He was a man who had lost something and had built a wall of solitude around the empty space it left behind. After 3 days, she could stand. Her feet, still bandaged, protested, but she could not bear to be useless. While he was out, he left for hours at a time, checking traps or riding the perimeter. She never knew. She began to move. She found the tattered ruin of her mother's veil in the bucket. It was stained with mud and blood, ripped almost in two. She washed it, her tears falling into the cold water. She scrubbed it with the harsh lye soap until her knuckles were raw. It would never be white again. It was a pale, ghostly gray, the lace torn, a map of her humiliation. When it was dry, she folded it into a small square and hid it at the bottom of her borrowed canvas sack. She found a broom and swept the floor. She washed his single plate, his single cup. Outside, tied to a post, was a shaggy white goat. Catherine had grown up in the country before her father's ambitions moved them to town. She found a bucket. The goat was stubborn, but she was patient. She managed to get a small pail of thin, musky milk. When Beau returned at dusk, he found her sitting on the stool, her bandaged feet propped up, stirring a pot on the stove. The shack was clean. The air smelled of wood smoke. Yes, but also of simmering stew. She had found a sack of dried beans, some jerky, and a few wild onions near the creek bed. He stopped in the doorway. His usual composure rattled. He looked at the clean floor, at the pot, at her. She looked like a child playing house, swallowed by his oversized shirt. "You should be resting," he said. "I am tired of resting," Catherine replied, her voice soft. "It is not much, but I use the beans." He entered, hung his hat on a peg. He ladled the stew onto his plate. He sat, he ate. Catherine watched him, her heart in her throat. He took several bites, the silence stretching. Finally, he looked up, meeting her gaze for the first in what felt like days. "It is good," he said. It was a small thing, but it felt like a truce. From then on, a routine was established. He did the heavy work, the riding, the wood chopping. She tended the fire, cooked the meals, milked the goat. Her presence, which had at first been an intrusion, began to soften the shack's hard edges. It was no longer just his sanctuary. It was their shelter. They began to talk, though their words were sparse, like seeds planted in hard ground. She would ask about the land. "What are those birds?" "Grouse," he would reply, not looking up. He would ask, "Are your feet hurting?" "Less today," she would say. One afternoon, a week after her arrival, the sound of riders sent a jolt of pure ice through her. She was outside, scattering feed for the goat, and she froze, her eyes wide with terror. 2 men on horseback were approaching from the valley. They were not cowboys. They wore dusty slickers, and their gun belts were slung low. They looked hard, mean. Beau came from around the side of the shack, his axe in his hand. He did not look at her, but he angled his body, placing himself between her and the riders. He stood easily. The axe held loose, but he was a picture of coiled strength. "Afternoon," one of the men called out, drawing his horse to a stop. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near Beau's boot. "This your place?" "It is," Beau said. The man's eyes slid past Beau, locking onto Catherine. He surveyed her, his gaze oily and assessing. He saw the bruises, still visible in the harsh light, and the way she trembled. "We are looking for something," the bounty hunter said, his voice a low drawl. "Property of Mr. Elias Mercer. A woman. Ran off on her wedding night. About her size. Dark hair." He smiled, a joyless flash of yellow teeth. "Wearing a wedding veil," they said. Catherine felt the world tilt. She could not breathe. Beau did not move. He did not look back at her. He kept his eyes on the rider. "Is that so?" "It is. Big reward. $500. The 2 men exchanged a look. The second man started to dismount. "We might just have a look inside your shack, friend." "I do not think you will," Beau said. His voice was still quiet, but the granite edge in it stopped the man cold. "She matches the description," the first hunter insisted, nodding at Catherine. Beau was silent for a long moment. He rubbed the scar on his jaw. "You are mistaken. This here is my cousin, Catherine Smith. She came up from Colorado last week to help me. Family business." The bounty hunter sneered. "She looks scared to death. What'd you do to her, friend? Maybe we should be claiming a reward on you." She is shy, Bo said, his voice flat. And she is not used to the company of men who smell like they have been sleeping in a hog pen. Now, you have my answer. You can ride on, or you can try to get off that horse. But I will tell you, the last man who tried to set foot on my claim uninvited is still pulling cactus needles out of his backside. It was not much of a threat, but the way he said it, combined with the steady, unnerving calm in his eyes, made the hunters pause. They looked at each other. They were two. He was one, but he was on his own ground, and he held an axe as if he knew how to use it for more than splitting wood. He did not look like $500. He looked like a lot of trouble. "Mercer ain't gonna like this," the first man grumbled. "I do not much care what Mr. Mercer likes," Bo said. "Ride on." The man spat again, then wheeled his horse around. "You're making a mistake, cowboy." They rode off, their backs stiff with anger. Catherine did not realize she had been holding her breath until she collapsed against the wall of the shack, her legs giving way. She was shaking so violently she could not stand. Bo did not come to her. He did not comfort her. He watched the riders until they were small specks in the distance. Then he turned, took a deep breath, and sank his axe into the chopping block. The thwack of the steel splitting the log was sharp, final. He continued splitting wood, each swing precise and powerful, as if he were working the fear and the rage out of his own body. That night, the silence in the shack was different. It was heavy, charged. The bounty hunters were gone. But the threat remained. Elias Mercer was looking for her. He had put a price on her head. She sat on her cot, her hands twisting in her lap. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the lamplight glinting on the oiled barrel. "You knew," she finally whispered. He did not pretend to misunderstand. He kept his eyes on his work. "I knew." "You knew I was not from a wagon." "I did." You knew who he was." "There is only one man in this valley who would do that to a woman and then send armed men after her like she was a stray cow. Elias Mercer." He said the name as if it were a curse. "You lied for me," she said, her voice trembling. "They could have shot you. Why? You do not know me." He stopped his work. He set the rifle down. He leaned forward, his forearms on the table, and for the first time, he truly looked at her. His gaze was intense, clear, and held a sorrow that mirrored her own. He rubbed the scar on his jaw. "I know enough," he said, his voice low. "I know what kind of man he is." He looked away, into the shadows in the corner of the room. "Men like that rancher, they do not deserve women like you." A single tear tracked down Catherine's cheek. He had not just lied for her. He had seen her. He had seen past the bruises, past the lies, and he had made a judgment. He had chosen her side. This new knowledge brewed a subtle, dangerous tension between them. He was no longer just a benefactor. He was her protector, and with that, the air grew thick with things unsaid. She began to fight a new battle. Her body was healing, but her mind was still raw. She was deeply, profoundly grateful to him. But a new feeling was mixing with the gratitude, a flicker of awareness. She noticed the breadth of his shoulders under the flannel, the way his dark hair curled at his collar. When he handed her the coffee cup, their fingers would sometimes brush. The contact was electric, and it terrified her. Any feeling of attraction felt like a betrayal. Elias had taught her that a man's desire was a weapon, a thing to be feared. This new, gentle awareness felt like a trick, a trap. She fought it. She became quieter, more reserved, building her own walls to match his. One night, the weather turned. A new storm, not as violent as the first, rolled in from the mountains. The wind howled, and the rain lashed against the small window pane. Catherine cooked their stew, and they ate in near silence, the sound of the storm filling the small room. She went to her cot, and he laid his bedroll by the door. Hours later, the thunder cracked, a sharp explosion that sounded like it was right on top of the shack. Catherine did not wake. She screamed. She was back in the dark, grim bedroom. Elias was standing over her, his face a mask of cold rage, his belt in his hand. The sound of the thunder was the sound of the blow, the sound of her own veil ripping. She thrashed, kicking at the bedroll, her hands flying up to protect her face. "No, please do not!" "Catherine!" A strong grip on her shoulders. She fought it, sobbing, striking out. "No, please, I will be good, please!" "Catherine, wake up! You are here! You are safe!" The voice was not Elias's. It was Beau's, rough, firm. She blinked, her eyes wide, unseeing. The lamplight was low. His face was above hers, etched with concern. He was holding her shoulders, pinning her to the cot. "You are safe," he repeated. "It is just the rain. You are in the shack. You are safe." The reality of it seeped in, the smell of juniper, the small, warm room. Beau, not Elias. She stopped fighting, her body collapsing in on itself in a wave of racking sobs. She was not in the ranch house. She was not being hurt. She was safe. She realized she was clinging to the front of his shirt, her fists balled in the thick wool. He was holding her, not with desire, but with a firm, grounding protection. His arms were steady, an anchor in her nightmare. It was the first time she had been held by a man and felt anything other than fear. He held her until the sobs quieted into shudders. He did not pat her back. He did not whisper comforting lies. He just held her, solid and unmoving, a bulwark against the storm and the memories. Finally, her breathing evened out. She loosened her grip on his shirt, her face burning with shame. "I am sorry," she whispered. He let her go, sitting back on his heels. "There is nothing to be sorry for." He stood, got her a cup of water, and stoked the fire. He did not go back to his bedroll. He sat in the chair, his rifle across his knees, and watched the fire until dawn. After that night, the last wall between them crumbled, and the words came. She told him, in small pieces, about her father, about the debt, about the advertisement in the Gazette. She did not speak of the wedding night itself. That was a horror she could not yet give voice to. But she did not have to. He understood. In return, he shared his own grief. He told her the scar was from barbed wire, a foolish accident. But his real scar, the one he rubbed when he thought she was not looking, was internal. "I had a wife," he said one evening, his voice aimed at the rising moon. "Sarah, and a son, Thomas. He was 4. He paused, and Catherine sat perfectly still, knowing this was a sacred confidence. "It was the diphtheria, back in Nebraska. It came through fast. Took the boy first, Sarah. She fought, but she was exhausted. She followed him a week later." He swallowed, his throat working. "There was nothing I could do. I buried them both myself. On a hill, under a cottonwood." He fell silent. "I have not loved anything since, except that fool horse. I came out here. A man can be alone in Wyoming." Now she understood. His solitude was not a preference. It was a memorial. They were 2 wounded souls, hiding in the wilderness. The tension between them did not disappear. It deepened. It was no longer the sharp fear of a new, unwanted desire. It was the heavy, pulling weight of a shared, unspoken understanding. He became protective in small ways. He made sure she had the warmest blanket. He saved her the best part of the stew. He began to cut her trousers from an old pair of his, and found a pair of worn-out boots that were closer to her size. A few days later, the air was warm. He had heated the big kettle on the stove and filled a wooden tub. "I am riding the south line," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I will be gone until dusk. The water is for you." He was giving her the gift of privacy. When he was gone, Catherine barred the door. She hung a blanket as an extra curtain. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she was truly alone and truly safe. She undressed, her body still a map of fading bruises. She sank into the hot water with a sigh that was half a sob. She scrubbed her skin, washing away the last of the fear, the last of the dirt, the last of Elias Mercer. She had her few things on a stool, the borrowed shirt, the cut trousers, and, on top, the small, folded gray square of her mother's veil. As she reached for the soap, her elbow bumped the stool. The folded veil teetered and fell, fluttering to the floor. It landed just outside the blanket curtain, near the door. She froze. The door creaked. Her heart stopped. He was back. She heard his boots on the floorboards. He had come back for something. "Catherine," he called, his voice muffled. She was naked, exposed, a thin blanket her only shield. She could not speak. He took a step, and then he stopped. He had seen it. He had seen the small, sad pile of torn lace on the floor. Catherine could hear the sharp intake of his breath. He knew what it was. It was the symbol of her shame, the proof of the bounty hunter's story, lying on the floor of his shack. There was a long, terrible silence. She waited, her entire body trembling, expecting she did not know what. Then she heard him move, but he did not come closer. He did not pull back the blanket. He turned his back. She heard his weight shift, the creak of the floorboards as he faced the door. "Your veil," he said. His voice was thick, strained. "It is on the floor." He didn't move. He averted his gaze. He stood with his back to her, guarding her privacy, giving her the dignity that Elias had ripped away. He was protecting her, even from himself. She quickly finished, her hands shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She dressed behind the curtain, her skin tingling. When she finally pushed the blanket aside, he was standing by the stove, his back still to her, his shoulders rigid. He was staring at the coffee pot as if it held the answers to the universe. The air in the small shack had changed. It was no longer still. It was vibrating. The unspoken desire, the shared grief, the profound respect, it had all coalesced into something new, something powerful, and something that neither of them knew what to do with. Catherine woke from a dream of being bound. It was a familiar terror, but this time, something was different. In the dream, the coarse hemp rope was tight around her wrists, anchoring her to the heavy oak bedstead. The shadow of Elias Mercer fell across her, cold and absolute. She heard his voice, not his words, but the flat, cruel tone of command. She struggled, but the knots held fast. Then, the dream shifted. The shadow receded. She was alone, still bound, but the terror was gone, replaced by a cold, sharp anger. She stopped pulling against the ropes and began to look at them. She examined the knot, her fingers, which had been numb, suddenly nimble. She began to work at the loop, her mind clear, focused. It was not a dream of helplessness. It was a dream of escape. She woke to the gray light of dawn, her heart pounding, her fingers tingling. She was not tied down. She was on the cot, safe, the smell of juniper in the air. Bo was already outside. The distant, rhythmic thwack of his axe, a steady heartbeat in the quiet morning. She sat up, the memory of the dream intensely clear. It was not the cruelty she remembered. It was the knot. It was the sudden, burning desire to control her own body, to be the one who tied or untied. Later that day, she retrieved the folded, ruined veil from her sack. The lace was gray, the edges frayed. It was a ghost of what it had been. She sat on the stool outside the shack, the weak spring sun on her shoulders, and began to twist the fabric. She tied a simple knot. She untied it. She tied it again, pulling it tight, watching the lace strain. She remembered knots from her childhood, the bow on her sash, the knot for a horse's tether. She began to practice, her fingers slowly gaining confidence. She made a loop, a slip knot, a hitch. She was not just fidgeting. She was studying. She was reclaiming the object of her humiliation and turning it into a tool. Bo returned, leading his horse, and paused when he saw her. He took in the sight, her sitting in the sun, her expression one of deep, almost grim concentration, her hands busy with the tattered lace. He said nothing, just led the horse to the trough. She felt his eyes on her and flushed, the dream logic suddenly seeming like madness. "Just seeing if it will hold," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally bright. She gave a small, brittle laugh. "Maybe I am learning to lasso." He stopped, his hand on the horse's neck. He looked at her, his gaze steady. He did not smile at the joke. He just nodded. A small, slow acknowledgement. He understood. She realized that this was not a game. He turned and began to unsaddle the paint, granting her the dignity of her strange, new purpose. A few days later, the larder was undeniably low. The bean sack was empty. The coffee tin held only dust, and they were down to their last handful of flour. "We have to go to town," Bo said. It was not a question. Catherine's blood ran cold. "Town? Thistle Hollow? I cannot. Bo, they are looking for me. Those men." "Those men are likely 50 miles from here by now, chasing some other rumor," he said, his voice practical. "But we need supplies. Ammunition, salt. I cannot leave you here alone for that long. It is not safe, and I cannot hunt with an empty cartridge belt." He was right. The logic was inescapable. "You will wear my hat," he said, pulling a wide-brimmed, stained hat from a peg. "And this," he tossed her a dark blue neckerchief. "With the trousers and the boots, in the shadow of the wagon, no one will look twice. They will see a ranch hand. A boy, maybe. We go in. We go to the mercantile. We leave. Fast." The ride to town was agony. Catherine wore the hat pulled so low it scratched her eyebrows, the kerchief high on her nose. She felt hidden, but also screamingly visible. A fraud. The trousers, which had felt like freedom in the wilderness, now felt like a costume that would be ripped away at any moment. She sat on the wagon bench, her hands knotted together, her eyes scanning the horizon. Bo was calm. He drove the team with a steady hand, his rifle resting beside him. He did not speak, sensing that any attempt at reassurance would only wind her tighter. Thistle Hollow looked the same, a dusty, sun-baked street of false hopes. But now, it was not just unwelcoming. It was enemy territory. Every window was an eye. Every man leaning against a porch rail was a threat. Bo pulled the wagon to a stop in the alley behind the mercantile. "Stay here, in the shade of the wagon. I will be quick." "No," Catherine said, the word sharp. She could not sit here, alone, exposed, her back to the street, waiting for a hand to grab her shoulder. "I will come. I can carry the flour." He looked at her, saw the glittering panic in her eyes, and knew it was the panic of a cornered animal. It was safer to keep her moving than to leave her trapped. He nodded. "Stay close. Keep your head down." The mercantile smelled of dust, pickles, and new denim. A pot-bellied stove stood cold in the center. The shopkeep, a thin man with spectacles, nodded at Bo. "Mr. Callan, been a while." "Just need supplies. Mr. Finch," Bo said, handing him a list. Catherine kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, the hat brim a shield. She could hear the murmur of voices, the clink of glass. She focused on Bo's back, a solid wall of gray flannel. "Mr. Finch was measuring out coffee beans when the door opened, its bell jangling. Catherine did not need to look. She knew the sound of the spurs. It was a heavy, arrogant sound, the jingle followed by the solid thud of high-heeled boots on the plank floor. "Finch," the voice boomed. "Got the order for the Mercer Ranch?" Ice, pure, liquid ice. It filled Catherine's veins. She could not move. She could not breathe. Her vision blurred, the sound of her own blood roaring in her ears, drowning out the man's voice. She was going to be sick. She recognized the voice. It was one of the men who had been at the ranch house, one of Elias's foremen. She took an involuntary step back, bumping into a barrel of nails. The foreman turned his head. "Well, what have we here?" Catherine froze, her face hidden, her body rigid. Before the man could take a second look, Bo moved. He did not grab her. He did not turn. He simply shifted his body. A slow, deliberate pivot, placing himself directly in her line of sight, blocking her from the foreman. He leaned on the counter, his back to the man. "You got that plug tobacco, Mr. Finch?" Bo asked, his voice unchanged, casual, almost bored. "Right here, Mr. Callan," the shopkeep said, his eyes flickering between the two men. "And a sack of feed for the horse, a big one." The foreman, his curiosity interrupted, snorted. He turned back to the counter, dismissing Bo and his ranch hand as unimportant. He began to argue with Finch about the price of barbed wire. Bo calmly paid for his supplies. He handed Catherine a small sack of beans, his fingers brushing hers. His hand was warm and steady, a silent message. "I am here." He picked up the heavy flour sack himself, and they walked out. Catherine did not dare look back. She kept her eyes on Bo's boots until they were back in the alley, the blessed shadowy safety of the alley. She was shaking so hard she dropped the bean sack. "Easy," Bo said, his voice low. He loaded the wagon, his movements economical and swift. "Get up on the bench." As he moved to the front of the wagon, he paused, his eyes fixed on the wall of the sheriff's office, just visible at the end of the alley. Catherine saw his body go still. "What is it?" she whispered. "Stay here. I forgot the feed sack." "You did not," she said. "You have it." "Stay," he commanded, his voice sharp. He walked out of the alley and across the street. She watched him. He stood in front of the sheriff's office for a long moment, reading something pinned to the wall. She saw his hands clench at his sides. Then he turned and walked back to the mercantile, disappearing inside. He came out a moment later with another, smaller sack, which he had clearly just purchased. He got on the wagon and snapped the reins. He did not speak. They were a mile out of town, the sun a hot weight on their shoulders, before Catherine broke the silence. The terror had faded, replaced by a cold dread. What was on that wall? Bo kept his eyes on the horses. "Nothing." "Bo, do not lie to me. Not now." He was silent for another long stretch. The only sound was the creak of the wagon wheels and the jingle of the harness. "It was a notice," he said finally, his voice flat. "A notice? For me?" He nodded. "A bounty?" "Yes." She closed her eyes. The man at the mercantile. He could have... $500, she whispered, remembering the bounty hunter. "More now," Bo said, his voice tight with a rage he was barely holding in. "He raised it, and he..." He stopped. "And what?" she insisted. "Tell me." He pulled the wagon to a halt. The horses stomped, flicking flies. He turned to her. His face was a hard mask. "He described you, and the veil, and he called you his property. Runaway bride, to be returned to her husband, Elias Mercer. His legal property. Property." The word struck her harder than Elias's hand. It was not a poster for a person. It was a bill of sale for livestock. A stray mare, a lost dog. She didn't cry. Not then. A cold, hard knot formed in her stomach. All the whispers, all the judgment, it all made sense. On the ride back, she had seen the women of the town. She had caught the eye of Mrs. Abernathy, the minister's wife, sweeping her porch. The woman had looked at Catherine's trousers, at her place beside Bo on the wagon, and her face had hardened into a mask of pure, righteous contempt. She had pulled her skirts aside, as if Catherine were a pile of filth. Catherine had seen it then, in their eyes. She was not a victim. She was not a runaway. She was a sinner, a soiled woman, a whore. Beau's kept woman. The prejudice of the civilized world was a blade just as sharp as Elias's cruelty. There was no one to help her. The law was on his side. The town was on his side. When they got back to the shack, Beau unhitched the team. Catherine walked to the woodpile. She sat on the chopping block, the world silent, the adrenaline gone, leaving her hollow. Beau came back. He stood in front of her. He was holding a piece of paper, the notice. He must have taken it down when he went back for the feed. He did not show it to her. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it on his boot heel, and lit the corner of the paper. They watched it burn. The edges curled, turning black. The words, Catherine Mercer and property, flared and vanished into ash. He let the last piece drop, grinding it into the dirt with his heel. It was only then that she cried. It was not the high, panicked weeping of her nightmares. It was a low, ragged, hopeless sobbing for the girl she had been, and for the woman she had become. A woman who was not a person, but a thing to be hunted and owned. The next morning, Catherine woke with a new, cold resolve. The shame was still there, but the fear had burned down into a hard ember of defiance. She took the trousers Beau had cut for her. They were rough, baggy, but they were sturdy. She put them on. She pulled on the thick wool socks and the worn boots. The boots were too large, but she stuffed the toes with rag. They were solid. They had soles. She stood. She felt different. The boots connected her to the ground. The trousers gave her a freedom of movement she had never known in skirts. She was not a doll in a white veil. She was not a cowering victim in a nightgown. She felt, for the first time, like a survivor. She was dressed for the land, not for a man's pleasure. She felt more like herself than she ever had in her life. That night, they sat outside. The air was warm, the sky a deep, bruised purple, and the first fireflies were rising from the creek bed, winking in the dusk. The silence was comfortable. The shared silence of two people who understood each other. She had been carrying the weight of the wedding night, a secret, black stone in her gut. His defense of her, the burning of the poster, his quiet respect, it had given her a small, safe space. She spoke to the fireflies. He never... Her voice was quiet, thick. He did not want what a husband wants. Not really. He wanted me to be afraid. Beau went very still, his hands resting on his knees. He did not look at her. He let her speak. It was cold, she whispered, the words tumbling out now, hushed and hurried. The room was so cold. He tore my veil. He told me I was nothing, that I was a debt paid. He used his belt. He wanted me to know I was property. She finally said the word aloud. Her voice did not break. He wanted me to cry. He struck me when I did. He said I was worthless, that I was a thing, just a thing for his use. She wrapped her arms around her knees, her whole body trembling with the memory. She had said it. She had given voice to the worst of it. Beau was silent. He did not move for a full minute. She could not see his face in the growing dark, but she could feel the rage coming off him. It was not a hot, loud rage, but a cold, killing one. His hands, resting on his knees, were clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He was tracing the scar on his jaw, back and forth, his thumb pressing hard into the skin. The silence stretched, and a new fear seized her, that she had disgusted him, that he, too, now saw her as soiled, as ruined. "Do you," she asked, her voice a thread, "do you think it was my fault? That I was weak?" His head snapped up. His answer was immediate, harsh, a crack in the quiet night. "No." He leaned toward her, his eyes glinting in the dusk. "No," he said again, his voice lower, but vibrating with conviction. There is no fault in you. A woman's will is her own. No man who touches a woman without her will. He is not a man at all. He is something less. He is an animal. The fault is his. The shame is his. Do not ever think it belongs to you." His words were a balm. They were an absolution. He had taken the black stone from her and thrown it into the darkness. She looked at him, at this quiet, solitary man who had buried his own life, who had protected her, who had lied for her, and who had just handed her back her own soul. She did not think, she acted. She leaned across the small space between them and pressed her mouth to his. It was not a calculated move. It was a pure, overwhelming impulse of gratitude, of recognition. His lips were chapped, tasting of coffee in the sharp night air. For a moment, he was perfectly still, a man of stone, shocked. Then, with a low groan that seemed to rise from the center of the earth, he responded. His hand came up, not to her shoulder, but to her face, his calloused thumb tracing her cheekbone, as if he were memorizing her. His other arm went around her, pulling her close. It was not the kiss of Elias, which had been a cold, bruising claim. This was a kiss of shared, desperate loneliness. It was tender. It was trembling. It was mutual. She felt a flicker of something new, something she had never felt before, a deep, pulling, unfamiliar heat. It was not fear. It was desire. The kiss deepened. His hold on her tightened, his mouth moving over hers with a hunger that she met with her own. It was a raw, aching need of two people who had been starved for a kind touch. Then, just as the heat was coiling tight in her stomach, he broke away. He pulled back, his breath ragged. He rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. He was shaking. "Catherine!" he rasped, his voice thick. She tried to lean back in, but he held her steady, his hands firm on her shoulders. "No," he whispered. "Not like this." She started, confused, the shame flooding back. Listen to me," he said, his voice urgent. He opened his eyes. They were dark, pained. "You deserve more than a moment of heat in a line shack. You deserve a choice, a real one. When you are not healing, when you are not running, when you—" He stopped, his throat working. "When you are free, I will not be another man who takes something from you." He was giving her back her control, even now. He gently released her and stood up, walking a few paces away, his back to her, staring out at the fireflies. He was giving her space. He was giving her time. He was giving her the one thing Elias Mercer had sworn she would never have again, a choice. The kiss hung in the air between them, a living, breathing thing. For 3 days. Neither Bo nor Catherine had spoken of it. They had resumed their quiet routine. But the silence was no longer peaceful. It was charged, taut, like a wire pulled tight. Every time their hands brushed as he passed her the coffee, every time their eyes met over the small fire, the memory of that desperate, trembling contact flared between them. Bo had given her a choice, and his respect was so profound that it terrified her. He had placed a power in her hands that she did not know what to do with. He slept on his bedroll by the door, a silent guardian, and she lay on the cot, her body aching with a confusion that was entirely new. She was no longer just afraid of a man's touch. She was afraid of her own. On the 4th night, the moon was a sliver, and the world outside the shack was wrapped in a profound, heavy blackness. Catherine was restless. She could not sleep. Bo, too, was awake. She could see the dark shape of him, sitting up on his bedroll, staring at the dying embers in the stove. "You should sleep," she whispered into the darkness. He did not turn. "You, too." "I cannot," she admitted. "Nor I." The silence stretched again. He was about to say something. She could feel it. When the goat, tethered outside, let out a single, terrified bleat. Bo was on his feet in one fluid motion, the sound not yet finished. He did not ask. He did not pause. He grabbed his rifle from the wall. "What is it?" Catherine whispered, her heart seizing. "Boots," he said, his voice a low, urgent command. "Now." Then she heard it, the heavy, rolling sound of multiple horses, not ambling, but moving fast, spreading out, encircling the shack. They were not bounty hunters this time. This was a posse. This was Elias. A rifle shot cracked through the night. It was not thunder. It was the sharp, lethal sound of a bullet. It splintered the wooden door frame, the sound impossibly loud in the small room. "Behind the stove!" Bo shoved her, and she scrambled into the corner, her body small. Another shot. Glass shattered as the single window exploded inward. "They mean to take you, Catherine," Bo said, his voice dangerously calm. He was checking the load in his rifle. "They do not mean to ask." A voice boomed from the darkness. It was the foreman from the mercantile. "We know you are in there, Callan. Mercer wants his wife. Send her out, and we will let you live." Bo let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. "Go to hell!" he shouted back. He fired, not at the voice, but at the flash of a muzzle he had seen by the creek. A man yelped in surprise. "The horse is on the back line," Bo said to her, his voice low, his eyes scanning the new, broken window. "We have to get to the horse. When I move to the door, you run for the shadows by the woodpile. Do not stop. Do not look back. Understand?" "They will shoot you," she cried, her voice a terrified hiss. "They are here to shoot me anyway," he said flatly. "You are the one they want alive. They will try to grab you, not kill you. Use it." He did not give her time to think. He kicked the small table, sending it scraping across the floor to block the door. He fired again through the window, then plunged the shack into darkness by kicking the small stove door shut, killing the light from the embers. "Now, Catherine, run!" He ripped the door open and laid down a covering fire, his rifle barking into the night. Catherine ran. She was barefoot, having had no time for boots, but she did not care. She flew from the cabin, her breath sobbing in her chest, the trousers giving her a speed her skirts never could have. She ran for the woodpile, just as a rider burst from the darkness. "There she is!" She heard the man crashing through the brush behind her. She did not look back. She plunged into the thicket of aspen and willow that lined the creek. The branches whipped her face, but she kept going, scrambling toward the small, hidden corral where Bo kept the paint. She heard gunfire. Close, too close. Bo was fighting, drawing their attention, buying her seconds. She reached the horse. It was frantic, pulling at its tether. Her hands, shaking violently, fumbled with the knot. She had practiced knots. She pulled the slip knot, and the rope came free. She grabbed the horse's mane, trying to swing up, but her bare feet slipped in the mud. A heavy body slammed into her, tackling her to the ground. It was the foreman. He was huge, his breath hot and smelling of whiskey. "Got you, you little hellcat!" He grabbed her arm. But Catherine was not the same woman who had crumpled in Elias's bedroom. She was a survivor. She was fire. She screamed, a raw, animal sound, and brought her knee up, hard, into his groin. The man roared, his grip loosening for just a second. It was all she needed. She rolled, scrambled, and grabbed the only weapon she could find, a thick branch. She swung it with all her strength, catching him across the side of the head. He staggered back, and in that instant, Bo was there. He burst from the trees, his rifle in one hand, his face a mask of fury. He did not shoot. He swung the rifle like a club, catching the foreman on the jaw. The man dropped like a sack of rocks. "Get on," Bo commanded. He threw her onto the paint's back and swung up behind her, his arms a steel cage around her. He kicked the horse, and it lunged, scrambling up the steep canyon wall, away from the shack, away from the creek, into the high, dark wilderness of the canyons. They rode for hours, They did not speak. The only sound was the horse's ragged breathing and the frantic pounding of Catherine's heart, which she could feel echoed in Beau's chest, pressed hard against her back. He had wrapped one arm around her waist, holding her steady, the other hand holding the reins and his rifle. They rode into the labyrinth of rocks, a place of shadows and sheer-walled passages where a posse could search for a month and find nothing. Beau knew the land. He navigated the darkness as if by second sight, pushing the horse until its sides were heaving and lathered in sweat. When the sky began to bleed gray in the east, he finally pulled the horse to a stop in a narrow wash, shielded from above by a massive overhang of red rock. He slid from the saddle, his body stiff. He reached up for her, and she fell into his arms, her legs too weak to hold her. He held her for a moment, his face buried in her hair, his whole body trembling with the aftermath of the fight. "You are all right," he whispered, not as a question, but as a statement, a prayer. "You?" she asked, pulling back. She saw him clearly now in the gray light. A long, bloody gash ran down his forearm, from his elbow to his wrist. He had been shot. "It is just a graze," he said, dismissing it. "Beau, it is deep." She tore a long strip from the hem of her borrowed shirt. "Sit, let me see it." He sat, wincing as the adrenaline faded. The wound was long, scoring the muscle, bleeding freely. It was not a graze. It was a deep cut, likely from a bullet or a knife in the dark. "We have to wash it," she said, her voice taking on a new, sharp authority. She took one of their 2 canteens and poured the precious water over the wound, her hand steady. He hissed, but did not move. She looked around, her eyes scanning the sparse vegetation at the mouth of the wash. "Stay here." She returned minutes later, her hands full of pale, silvery green leaves. "Yarrow," she said. "My mother taught me. It will stop the bleeding and clean the wound." She bruised the leaves between 2 rocks, mixing them with a few drops of water to make a green, pungent poultice. He watched her, his eyes full of a new, profound respect. She was not the terrified girl he had pulled from the mud. She was calm. She was competent. She packed the poultice into the wound, her touch gentle but firm, and then bound his arm tightly with the strip of cloth. "You are good at that," he said, his voice rough. "I am a quick learner," she replied, meeting his gaze. They rested for an hour, then moved on. They could not risk staying. They walked now, leading the exhausted horse, conserving its strength. Catherine, her bare feet cut and bruised again by the sharp rocks, did not complain. She just tore more strips from her shirt and wrapped them around her feet. For 2 days, they moved deeper into the canyons. Catherine's role shifted. She was no longer a passenger. Her eyes were sharp. She spotted the small seep of water that saved them. She found a patch of wild onions and dug the roots with a sharp stick, giving them their first food in a day. She began to anticipate the horse's needs, to see the easier paths. Beau, his arm stiff and sore, began to trust her judgment. "That way," she said, pointing to a narrow game trail. "It stays to the high ground. We will see them before they see us." He just nodded and followed her lead. On the 3rd evening, as the sun was setting, painting the canyon walls in hues of blood and gold, Beau stopped. "Up here," he'd said. He led her up a steep, narrow path, almost invisible, hidden behind a curtain of ancient, gnarled brush. Behind it was a dark opening in the cliff face, a cave. It was not a deep cavern, but a wide, dry shelter. The floor was sand, and a small opening in the roof served as a natural chimney. From the mouth, they could see for miles down the canyon, but they were completely hidden from below, in the crevices of the rock near the entrance. Small, stubborn wildflowers bloomed, bright red Indian paintbrush and pale, delicate columbine. "I have used it for trapping," Beau said, sliding the saddle from the horse's back. "It is dry. It is safe." It was more than safe. It was a sanctuary. After the oppressive grimness of the ranch house and the desperate vulnerability of the shack, this cave felt like a fortress. It was their own, a secret place. They made a small, smokeless fire of dry juniper. The horse was tethered at the back of the cave. They were exhausted, but they were alive. The tension from the interrupted kiss, forgotten in the flight, returned, heavier and deeper. They were trapped, alone, in the most intimate of spaces. They sat close, sharing the single bedroll as a blanket, the firelight warming their faces. Catherine looked at Beau. His face was stained with dirt and dried blood, his scar stark in the firelight. He looked tired, but he looked strong. He was the man who had given her back her will. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and lightly touched the back of his hand. He froze, his entire body going still. She did not pull away. She gently, deliberately, took his hand. It was rough, warm, and so much larger than hers. She lifted it, slowly, and pressed his calloused palm to her cheek. She closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. It was a gesture of absolute, terrifying trust. She heard his breath catch. "Catherine," he whispered. It was a question. It was a warning. She opened her eyes. She reached into the pocket of her trousers and pulled out the one thing she had saved, the one thing she had grabbed from the floor of the shack before she fled. The folded, tattered gray square of her mother's veil. He stared at it, his eyes full of a painful understanding. "I am still afraid. Beau," she whispered, her voice so low it was almost lost to the wind sighing at the cave's mouth. "I am so afraid, but I am not afraid of you." She took his right hand, the one that was not wounded. She uncurled his fingers, and then, with slow, deliberate movements, she wrapped the soft, torn lace around his wrist. Once, twice, she tied a soft, simple knot. He watched her, his face a mask of disbelief, his hand completely passive, letting her. She took his other wrist and did the same. She tied the second knot, her fingers sure. He was not chained. He was not bound. He was a man of immense strength, and he was yielding it to her. His hands rested in his lap, tied by a ghost. It was the complete opposite of her nightmare. She was not the one tied down. She was the one in control. She looked at what she had done, at this powerful man letting her, trusting her. A small, strange, trembling laugh bubbled up in her throat. It was absurd, it was profound. And then the laugh broke, and a single tear slipped down her cheek, hot and stinging. She was laughing and crying at the same time. "It hurts," she whispered, the words tearing from her. Beau's face filled with alarm. He thought he had hurt her, that her mind was breaking. "Catherine." "No," she said, touching his chest, right over his heart. "It hurts here." She took a shuddering breath, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It is my first time." He frowned, his brows drawing together, confused. My first choice," she breathed. "My first time, feeling safe enough to choose. My first time." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "My first time, wanting." This time, when she leaned in to kiss him, there was no desperation. It was slow. It was deliberate. It was a question she was finally, truly, allowed to ask. His lips were warm. He remained perfectly still, his hands bound, honoring her lead. She kissed him, an exploration. She was learning the shape of his mouth, the rough texture of his jaw. It was not the raw hunger of the shack. It was a deep, healing tenderness. It was not a fire. It was a warm, glowing ember. It was not about passion. It was about reclaiming the very idea of touch. She rested her forehead against his, her hands framing his face. "I want to give," she whispered, the words a sacred vow in the darkness. "I do not want to be taken, not ever again." He understood. He understood everything. Slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. He worked his hands, and the soft lace fell away. He cupped her face, his thumbs gently brushing away her tears. "Catherine," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he could not name. He did not say, "I love you." He said, "You are safe with me. Always." He held her, and the dam broke. The laughter and the sobs came together, a torrent of release, all the fear, all the shame, all the pain of the last weeks. She wept for the girl she had been and the woman she was becoming, and he held her, his own eyes wet, his own grief for his lost wife and child mingling with hers. They were no longer a cowboy and a runaway bride. They were just two wounded souls, clinging to each other in a cave, surviving. Later, wrapped in the bedroll, the fire burned low. They talked. It was the first time they had ever spoken of a future. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice small against his chest. "He will never stop." "We will go north," he said, his voice a low rumble. "To Montana. I have heard of the high meadow country. A man can build a cabin, run a few head, a man can be left alone." "Oregon," she countered, a small smile in her voice. "I read a book about the Willamette Valley. It is green, all year." "Maybe Oregon, then," he said, and she could hear the smile in his too. It was a fragile, impossible dream, but it was theirs. The next morning, the mood was different. It was lighter. The terror had passed, leaving a quiet, shared intimacy. Catherine was exploring the back of the cave, where the previous occupants had left their refuse. She found a bundle of rotted canvas. Curious, she pulled it out. Inside was a heavy, dark object, an old revolver, pitted with rust. "Bo," she said, her voice hushed. "Look." He took it from her. It was an old model, a single action, heavy and cold. But he checked the action, and it moved. Stiffly, but it moved. He had ammunition in his saddlebag that would fit. He spent an hour cleaning it, his hands careful and precise. The rust came away, revealing the dark steel beneath. He oiled it, and the action clicked, sharp and clean. He loaded one chamber, then he held it out to her. "But first, it is time," he said. He took her to a small alcove just outside the cave, a natural box of rock that would muffle the sound. He put a small rock on a ledge. "Feel the weight of it," he said. "It is not a toy. It is a tool, nothing more. You do not pull the trigger. You squeeze it. Slow." She took the gun. It was heavy, unbelievably heavy. She raised it, her arm trembling, and aimed at the rock. She flinched, pulling the trigger. The explosion was deafening. It kicked hard, stinging her hand, and the bullet went wide, chipping the rock face a foot to the left. She lowered the gun, her hand shaking. "I cannot." Bo put his hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm. "Elias called you property," he said, his voice hard as the canyon rock. "Property is a thing. It is helpless. It is what he wanted you to be." He made her meet his gaze. His eyes were clear, fierce. "You are not property. Catherine, you are fire. Now, aim again." The high canyon air was thin and cold, but the sanctuary of the cave was a fragile truce. For a week, they lived in the rock, mending. Catherine's feet hardened. Bo's arm began to heal, the yarrow poultice doing its work under her careful tending. They practiced with the revolver. Her hands, once soft, grew steady. The recoil no longer made her flinch. The fire he had spoken of was finding its tinder. They spoke of Oregon in hushed, late-night tones. It was a dream, a prayer, a single point of light in a vast, encroaching darkness. But the reality of their world was simple. They were running out of food. The horse was thin. The world was large. But Elias Mercer owned the valley, and the valley was the only way out. "I have to go," Bo said one morning, the words hanging heavy and final in the small space. Catherine's head snapped up. She was cleaning the revolver, a new, familiar ritual. Go where? Not Thistle Hollow. Not again. They will be watching. They will kill you. Not Thistle Hollow, he agreed, his face grim. The railroad line. There is a telegraph station at Pine Ridge, 30 miles east. It is just a shack and a water tower. They sell supplies to the train crews. It is a risk, but it is a smaller one. We need salt. We need flour. And we need to know what he is doing. She hated it. She hated the idea of him leaving, of being alone. But she saw the hard set of his jaw. He was right. He left before dawn, the paint horse moving like a ghost through the canyon passes. Catherine was alone in the cave. She sat at the mouth, the revolver in her lap, and watched the empty canyon. It was the longest day of her life. Every gust of wind was a horseman. Every shadow was a threat. She was not the same woman who had fled the ranch house, but the fear was a cold, familiar companion. He returned 2 days later. Well after dusk, she was waiting, her body rigid with tension. She saw the paint horse stumble, exhausted, and she ran to meet him, her heart in her throat. Bo did not look like a man who had been successful. He slid from the saddle, his body moving like a jointless thing. He looked older. He looked broken. "Bo, what is it? Are you hurt?" He did not answer. He walked past her into the cave and sat heavily by the cold fire pit. He had a sack of supplies, flour, salt, coffee, but he let it fall to the dirt floor. "What happened?" she demanded, her voice rising. He reached into his shirt pocket and pulled out a flimsy, folded piece of paper. He handed it to her. It was a telegraph flimsy. "I was at the station," he said, his voice a dead, flat monotone. "The operator, he is a young kid. He knows me. I was buying the coffee. This came through. For the sheriff in Thistle Hollow. The kid knows I ride that way sometimes. Asked if I would take it. Save him the trouble of finding a messenger." She unfolded the paper, her hands shaking. The message was in coded stops, but the operator had transcribed it beneath. To Sheriff T. Gable, Thistle Hollow. From Judge M. Harrison, Cheyenne. Per request of E. Mercer. Marriage certificate filed and validated. Wife. Catherine Carmichael Mercer is legal property, pursuant to territorial law. She is a fugitive from a legal union. You are empowered to use all necessary force to reclaim said property. Reward is authorized. Property. The word again. It was not a poster this time. It was the law. The law, signed by a judge, empowered by her husband. Elias had not just put a price on her. He had weaponized the entire territory against her. "This is not all," Bo said, his voice so low she could barely hear him. She looked at him, a new, colder terror dawning. "What do you mean?" There was another wire, on the operator's desk. He had just sent it for Mercer. Mercer must have ridden to Pine Ridge himself. The kid, he thought it was strange. He was talking about it. Bo rubbed his face, his hand scrubbing at the exhaustion, at the horror. It was not to the sheriff. It was to a man in Cheyenne. It was instructions. Instructions. He met her gaze. His eyes were full of a terrible, cold rage. "He plans to sell you, Catherine." She stared, not understanding. "Sell me?" "To a brothel," Bo said, the words torn from him, raw and brutal. "A place run by a woman, a madam, in Cheyenne. He was confirming the price. He is not hunting you to get his wife back. He is hunting you to sell you like livestock, because you defied him." The cave, her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a tomb. The air was too thin to breathe. She was not a person. She was not even property. She was cargo, to be used, broken, and sold. She began to shake, a deep, rattling tremor that started in her bones. "No," she whispered. "No, he cannot." "He can," Bo said, "and he has the law on his side to do it." She looked at the supplies, the flour, the coffee. She looked at the dream of Oregon. It was Ash. It was a joke. "We have to run," she said, her voice frantic. She grabbed the sack. "We have to go, now! Tonight, we go north! We can hide! We can live on roots! We can—" "Run where?" Beau's voice was quiet, but it cut through her panic. "There is nowhere to run. That telegram went to the law. Every sheriff, every marshal, from here to Montana will have that description. We will be hunted, and the first time we are caught, they will not bring you back here. They will put you on a train to Cheyenne." "So what, Beau? What do? We wait here until they find us?" she cried, the tears she had held back finally streaming down her face. "I am so tired. I am so tired of being hunted. I am tired of the pain. I just want it to stop." "We stop it," he said. "How?" "We fight." He stood up, his body radiating a lethal energy. "We cannot run from this. I will not let him do this to you. I will not lose you, Catherine, not to the wilderness, and not to that. We ride back." She stared at him as if he were mad. "Ride back? Back to the ranch? He has men. He has the law. They will kill you and they will take me. That is not a fight. That is surrender." "It is not a surrender," he said, his voice hard. "It is an attack. He thinks you are a terrified girl. He thinks you are broken. He thinks you are running, hiding in a hole. He is not expecting you to walk back into his house." "And what then?" she shrieked. "We just—" "What? Ask him to stop? He will shoot us on sight." "I will not let him," Beau said. "I will end this. I will end him." The raw finality in his voice chilled her more than the telegram. He meant to kill Elias Mercer. "No," she said. "No. I will not trade one monster for another. I will not have you hang for me. Beau, I will not let you become a murderer for me." Then he wins. He wins. He will have destroyed us both. They stood, 2 feet apart, a chasm between them. Her, desperate to flee, to find any small corner of the world where she could be invisible. Him, coiled and ready to strike, to meet violence with greater violence. He did not want to lose her. She did not want to lose him, to the gentry, or to the gallows. She looked at the revolver, lying on the stone ledge. She looked at the torn strip of her veil, which she had used to clean it, lying beside it. Property. The word echoed. The judge's word. Elias's word. The word that had defined her. She picked up the revolver. It was heavy, solid, real. She picked up the strip of lace. It was light, tattered. A ghost. If she ran, she would be property forever. She would be the runaway bride, a fugitive, a whispered-about thing, always looking over her shoulder, always afraid. The fear would be her master. Elias would have won. He would own her, even from 100 miles away. He would own her mind. If she went back, she might die, Beau might die, but she would die as Catherine, not as property. She turned to Beau. The argument was over. The tears were dry. Her eyes were as cold and hard as the steel in her hand. "You are right," she said, her voice quiet, but it did not tremble. "We ride back, but we do it my way. You will not kill him." "Catherine." "No," she said, her voice absolute. "You will not be a murderer. This is not about revenge. This is about my name. This is about my life. I am not a thing to be sold. I am not a debt to be paid. No man gets to own me." He saw the fire in her. The fire he had named. It was burning bright. He nodded, his rage yielding to her resolve. They rode back to Thistle Hollow under the cover of dusk. They did not use the main road. They used the high game trails, the shadowy washes, the land they had come to know as fugitives. The ride was silent, a long, taut prayer. They left the horse in a thicket of cottonwoods a mile from the ranch house. They walked the rest of the way, 2 shadows moving against the darkening prairie. The house was lit, a grim square of yellow light in the vast darkness. It looked just as it had that first night, imposing, cold. His men are out, Bo whispered, pointing to the empty bunkhouse. They are out hunting for us. He is likely alone. Or with his foreman, Catherine breathed. I will go in first, Bo said, drawing his revolver. No. She put her hand on his arm. His good arm. No, this is my fight. He is expecting his men. He's expecting a broken, terrified girl. He is not expecting me. You wait. You are my insurance. Catherine, he will kill you. He will try, she said. She reached up and touched his face, his scar. He thinks I am weak. That is the only weapon I have. Let me use it. Wait until you hear me. Wait for my signal. And if you do not signal, then you do what you have to do. She took a deep breath. From her pocket, she pulled the tattered gray scrap of her mother's veil. She did not put it on her head. She held it, crushed, in her left hand, in her right, hidden in the folds of her trousers. She held the old, cold revolver. She walked out of the shadows, across the yard, and up the steps of the porch. She did not knock. She opened the door and walked in. Elias Mercer was at his desk, the same dark, oppressive room where he had sealed her fate. A bottle of whiskey and a glass were beside him. He was alone. He looked up when the door opened, his face a mask of annoyance, expecting his foreman. When he saw her, he froze. His pale eyes widened, not in fear, but in a kind of predatory shock, a disbelief. She stood there, in the center of the room, a strange, wild figure. Her hair was matted, her face smudged with dirt. She was wearing a man's torn shirt and trousers, and in her hand, she was clutching a dirty, ruined piece of lace. He recovered quickly. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. So, he said, his voice a low, satisfied drawl. The property returns. Tired of the cold. Were you? Tired of your cowboy? You finally learned your place. I have come back, Catherine said, her voice clear, cold. It did not shake. You have, he agreed. He stood, his bulk filling the room. And you will be taught a lesson for the trouble you have caused me. A lesson you will never, ever forget. You will beg me before I am through. Then I will send you to Cheyenne, where you will learn what true obedience is. He took a step toward her. Give me the gun I know he gave you. I do not have a gun, she lied. He laughed, a short, ugly sound. It does not matter. He lunged, his hand raised, not to grab, but to strike, an open-handed blow designed to humiliate, to shatter her defiance with one casual act of violence. No, she said. The door burst open. Bo was there, his revolver leveled, his face a white mask of fury. Get away from her, Mercer! Elias stopped, his hand still in the air. He saw Bo, and his smile only widened. Callan, I should have known you were too stupid to run. You brought her back to me. Excellent. I will have my men hang you in the morning. It is over, Bo said, his voice tight. It is, Elias agreed. He moved with a speed that belied his size. He was not lunging for Catherine. He kicked the desk. The heavy oak piece slammed into Bo's legs, sending him off balance. In the same motion, Elias drew the revolver that had been sitting in his lap, hidden by the desk. A shot exploded. The sound was deafening in the enclosed room. Bo cried out, a sharp, ragged gasp, and stumbled back. He clutched his shoulder, a dark, spreading stain blossoming on his shirt. His gun clattered to the floor. Elias turned his own gun on the wounded Bo, his smile one of pure triumph. Now, he said, we end this. No! Catherine screamed. She did not think. She did not aim. She did not even remember pulling the revolver from her trousers. She just raised it, her hand shaking, and pulled the trigger, firing into the air, at the ceiling. The shot was a punctuation, a final, absolute stop. The explosion of her gun was followed by a new sound, shouting, the thunder of boots on the porch. The gunfire had been heard. The door flew open again, and the room was suddenly full of people, ranch hands, their wives, and townsfolk, drawn by the sound of a gunfight at the main house. The sheriff, T. Gable, was at the front, his own gun drawn, his face pale and sweating. They all froze, taking in the scene. Bo, leaning against the wall, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Elias Mercer, his gun still aimed, his face twisted in fury. And Catherine, standing in the center of the room, a wild thing in trousers, her arms still raised, smoke coiling from the barrel of the revolver in her hand. "What in God's name?" the sheriff breathed. "Sheriff, arrest this woman!" Elias roared, regaining control. He lowered his gun, sensing the shift in power. "She is my runaway wife. She came in here with this man, Callan. They tried to murder me. She shot him." He pointed to Bo. The crowd murmured. They looked at Catherine. This strange, unsexed creature. They looked at the bleeding Bo. Elias's story made sense. "He is lying," Catherine said. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the murmurs. She lowered the gun, but did not drop it. She looked at the crowd. She saw the faces from the mercantile. She saw the women who had scorned her. "He is lying," she said again. "My name is Catherine. I was sold to him, by my father, to pay a debt. I came here to be his wife." She held up the tattered veil in her other hand. "This was my mother's. He tore it from my head on my wedding night. He did not want a wife. He wanted property." She told them everything. The cold room, the humiliation, the escape into the storm, the bounty hunters, the poster that called her a thing to be owned. "He sent these men," she pointed to the foreman, who was standing in the back, his face white, "to drag me back. When they failed, he got the law on his side." She looked right at the sheriff. "He had a judge declare me a fugitive, because I would not be his slave." The room was silent. "He shot this man," she said, her voice finally breaking, pointing at Bo. "He shot Mr. Callan, because he helped me, because he gave me shelter when I was dying." "She is hysterical," Elias shouted. "She is mad. It is lies. All of it. She is my legal, wedded wife." "Then what is this?" Catherine cried, her voice ringing with a righteous, terrible fury. She strode to Bo, who was slumped, pale, but watching her with a burning pride. She reached into his pocket and pulled out the telegram, the one about Cheyenne. She did not read it. She threw it at the sheriff. "Read it! Read what he planned to do with his legal, wedded wife! Read it aloud!" The sheriff's hands trembled as he unfolded the flimsy. He read the words, his voice stammering. "Madam Sylvie's, ready. Agreed price. Expect delivery." A woman in the crowd gasped. "He was going to sell me," Catherine said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because I would not obey. Because I ran." A silence, thick and horrified, filled the room. The people had feared Elias. They had respected his power. But this was not power. This was monstrous. An older woman at the front of the crowd, her face a web of wrinkles, stepped forward. It was Martha Sims, a widow who ran a small bakery in town, a woman who had buried 3 children and feared no one. "He is telling the truth," she said, her voice frail but iron-strong. She pointed a gnarled finger at Elias. "He did the same to my girl, my Mary. She was a fool. She went with one of his hands. When she came back, disgraced, he found a place for her. In Cheyenne. She died there. In a house like that. He did not sell her. He gave her away. Like a sick animal." A low, angry growl rose from the crowd. Other voices joined. The man whose water rights Mercer had stolen. The rancher whose cattle had been scattered. The foreman's lie about Bo shooting himself was drowned out by a decade of repressed fear and anger. All of it finally uncorked. The tide had not just turned. It was a flood. Elias Mercer looked from the crowd to the sheriff, to Catherine. His power, built on fear and wealth, was dissolving. The sheriff, T. Gable, was a man who prized his own survival above all. He had been bought, but he saw the new, higher bid, the will of the people. He looked at the telegram in his hand. Assault, kidnapping, trafficking. He holstered his weapon. He looked at Elias, his face a mask of cold. Official duty. Elias Mercer, he said, his voice loud for the crowd. The marriage is declared invalid, performed under clear duress and for illegal purposes. You are under arrest for the assault of this woman, for the shooting of Bo Callan, and for the trafficking of women. The ranch house was a vortex of noise. The sheriff, suddenly and violently restored to his duty by the will of the crowd, was barking orders. Elias Mercer, his face a mask of purple, apoplectic rage, was roaring about judges and lawyers as two deputies bound his hands. Men were shouting. Women were weeping. But Catherine heard none of it. She had dropped the revolver. Her world had shrunk to a single point. Bo, slumped against the wall, his face the color of wet ash, his hand clamped over the blossoming red stain on his shoulder. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands, still shaking, hovering over his wound. Bo, look at me. His eyes, clouded with pain, found hers. He managed a grim, terrible smile. Told you, you were fire. Stupid, she whispered, the tears she had held back now scalding her face. Stupid, stubborn man, you were supposed to wait. Did not like his tone, he gasped. Martha Sims, the widow, was beside her. He is bleeding badly. We have to get him out of this cursed house. They did not go to the town jail or the doctor's office. Martha, with the grim authority of a woman who had seen too much death, directed everything. She sent her son, a quiet man of 30, to fetch the doctor. She had Bo carried, not to her own small house, but to the line shack. He is a man of the open, Martha said, her voice firm, overruling Catherine's protests. He will not heal in a box. He will heal where he is free. So they took him back to the small, sparse room that had been their sanctuary. This time, Catherine rode in the wagon, cradling Bo's head in her lap, her hand pressed tight against his shoulder to slow the bleeding. The doctor, a nervous man who had long been in Mercer's pocket, worked by lantern light, his hands trembling. He had been sobered by the night's events. The bullet went clean through, he announced, his voice reedy. Tore the muscle, but it missed the bone, missed the artery. He is a very lucky man, or a very unlucky one, depending on how you see it. He stitched the wound, bound it tightly, and left a small bottle of laudanum. He will have a fever. Keep him clean. Keep him still. The rest is up to God and him. For 10 days, Catherine did not leave the shack. The world outside, the trial of Elias Mercer, the scandal that was rocking Thistle Hollow, the future of the valley, was a distant rumor. Her entire universe was the cot, the bucket of cooling water, and the sound of Bo's breathing. He was not a good patient. The fever came, as the doctor had promised. It was a high, raging fire that consumed him. He thrashed in the grip of it, his mind lost in a wilderness of his own. He cried out, not for her, but for them. "Sarah!" he would shout, his eyes wide and unseeing, staring at the ceiling. "The water! She needs water! Thomas! My boy! My boy!" Catherine sat beside him, her hand gripping his, her heart breaking in a new and different way. She was not jealous of his ghosts. She was humbled by them. She saw the depth of the love he was capable of, the profound wound he had carried, hidden beneath his silence. She bathed his face. She forced water and thin broth between his cracked lips. She held him down when he tried to rise, her voice a low, steady anchor in his storm. "It is all right, Bo," she would murmur, hour after hour. "I am here. It is Catherine. You are safe." You are safe. On the 11th day, she was asleep in the chair, her head on her arms, exhausted, when a hand, calloused and weak, touched her hair. She woke with a start. He was looking at her. His eyes were clear. The fever had broken. "Catherine," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. She sobbed, a single sharp sound of pure relief, and gripped his hand. "You are back." "You stayed," he said, his gaze taking in the room, her exhausted face. "I told you," she said, her voice thick. "No man gets to own me, and no fever gets to take you. I would not let it." He recovered slowly, under the wide Wyoming sky. When he was strong enough to sit, she moved the stool outside, into the warm spring sun. She would sit on the ground, leaning against his knees, while he slowly regained his strength. The land around them was bursting with new, defiant life. The prairie grass was green, and the air was sweet with the smell of sage and clover. News came from Mr. Finch, the mercantile owner, who rode out once a week with supplies paid for by a town fund. A quiet apology from the people of Thistle Hollow. Elias Mercer was gone. He had been tried. And with the testimony of Catherine, Martha Sims, and a dozen others who had finally found their courage. He was found guilty. He was on a prison train, bound for a federal penitentiary. The ranch was in the hands of the bank. The bounty was lifted. The shadow was gone. They were free. But the emotional wounds lingered. They were quiet. The terror had passed, but the shock remained. They were two people who had walked through a fire, and the world on the other side felt strange. Too bright. They were gentle with each other, their conversations practical, their touches few. They were healing, separately, even as they sat together. One afternoon, Bo was well enough to walk to the creek and back. He was sitting on the chopping block, his arm in a sling, watching her. Catherine had been cleaning the shack, sweeping away the last of the fear. She found it at the bottom of her sack, where she had thrust it before riding back to the ranch. Her veil. She held the tattered gray square of lace in her hands. It was stiff with dirt and old fear. It was the last piece of Catherine Carmichael, the last piece of Mrs. Elias Mercer. She walked outside, past Bo. He watched her, but said nothing. He knew this was a private thing. She built a small fire, separate from the cooking fire. She knelt before it. She held the veil over the new, clean flames. "You are not my mother's," she whispered to it. "You are not hope. You are not purity. You are a debt. You are a cage. You are his." She let it drop. The delicate lace caught instantly. It flared, a bright, hot orange, then quickly shriveled, curling into a black, brittle skeleton of itself. She watched until it was nothing but fine, white ash. She felt a weight lift from her chest that she had not even realized she was carrying. She stood. The fire was out, but then she saw it, lying on the ground near her foot. A single strip of the lace, the long piece she had torn off to bind Bo's wound, the same piece she had used to tie his hands in the cave. It had fallen from her pocket. It had not burned. It was different. It had never been part of the lie. It had been part of their truth. She picked it up. She walked to Bo. He looked up at her, his eyes questioning. She said nothing. She knelt before him. She took his good wrist, slowly, gently. She tied the soft, gray strip of lace around it. It was not a restraint. It was not a game of trust. It was a token, a promise, a brand of her own choosing. He looked at the lace, then at her. He touched her face, his thumb tracing the faint, fading scar on her lip. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. They left Thith Moves in the morning. They did not ride south, toward the railroad line. They rode west, toward the mountains. Bo was strong enough to ride, his arm still bound to his chest. "There is one last thing," he said, "before we go north. A place I have to see." She nodded. She knew. They rode for half a day, climbing into the high foothills, to a ridge that overlooked a long, quiet valley. Under a single massive cottonwood tree, there were two small, weathered crosses. Bo dismounted. He stood before the graves, his hat in his hands. He was silent for a long time. Catherine did not approach. She gave him his space, his time to say goodbye. She watched this strong, quiet man who had saved her, now undone by a grief a decade old. She dismounted and walked, not to him, but to a patch of wildflowers growing by a stream. She gathered a small, bright bouquet of bluebells and Indian paintbrush. She came and stood beside him, shoulder to shoulder. He did not look at her, but she felt him acknowledge her. She knelt and laid the flowers at the base of the two crosses, one for Sarah, one for Thomas. She did not say she was sorry. She just knelt there, sharing his loss, her presence a silent promise that he would not be alone with his grief anymore. He put his hand on her shoulder. She covered it with her own. They stood like that for a long time. The wind in the cottonwood leaves the only sound. When he finally turned to go, he did not look back. He had closed his door. They traveled north. They sold the line shack and the small plot of land to Mr. Finch for a fair price. It gave them enough to buy a second horse, a sturdy mule, and a proper outfit. They left Thistle Hollow without a single look behind. They crossed rivers, the water fast and cold, the horses swimming, the mule complaining. They pushed across wide, open plains where the sky was a massive, aching blue bowl, and they felt like the only two people left in the world. They climbed into foothills that smelled of pine and damp earth. They slept beside the fire. At first, Catherine would wake at every sound, her hand reaching for the revolver that was now hers. But Beau's presence was a steady, warm line beside her. His breathing was even. He was not afraid. Slowly, her nightmares faded. The terror that had been her shadow for so long finally receded. She stopped waking at the snap of a twig. She began to sleep, deeply. For the first time in her life, she felt truly, completely safe. One evening, they made camp in a high meadow. The air was crisp, and the stars looked close enough to touch. The fire was a small, glowing ember. They sat wrapped in their bedrolls, side by side, watching the flames. The journey had been hard. It had been raw, but it had been theirs. Every mile was a mile they had chosen. Catherine looked at Beau. His face was turned to the fire, the light catching the silver in his hair, the pale line of his scar. The strip of lace was still on his wrist, now dark with trail dust. She reached out and took his hand, his good hand. He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a quiet, waiting question. She smiled, a small, soft smile. "This time," she whispered, her voice a part of the wind. "It is ours to choose." He held her gaze, and in his eyes she saw no ghosts, no grief, only her. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "It is," he agreed. They found their valley in Montana. It was high, protected by a ring of snow-capped mountains, carpeted in grass so green it hurt the eyes. A river, clear and cold, ran through it. They built their cabin. It was not a grim, dark fortress like Elias's ranch. It was small, sturdy, made of pine logs that they had cut and peeled themselves. He was the strength, cutting the timber, raising the beams. She was the heart, chinking the logs with mud and moss, planting a small garden. Her hands, once soft, now strong and brown from the work. They were survivors. They were lovers. They were equals. One evening, as the first snows of winter were beginning to dust the peaks, they stood in the doorway of their finished home. The cabin smelled of new-cut pine, wood smoke, and baking bread. A thin line of smoke rose from their chimney, a testament to their life, their warmth, their future. Beau stood behind her, his arms wrapped around her waist. Catherine leaned back against his chest, her hands resting on his. She looked at her own hands. They were chapped, scarred, the nails broken. They were the hands of a woman who was free. She felt a strange, sharp tightness in her chest. It was a feeling so profound, so full, that it was almost a pain. It was joy, real and hard-won. "It hurts," she whispered, a small, trembling smile on her lips. "But only because it is real." Thank you for listening to our story. We would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, so let us know where you are listening from and connect with other listeners. Be sure to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts.